What sort of truth can lie for 30 years in a village garden, light as a paper petal and sharp enough to kill? Who kept the dead woman's secret for 30 years? A Miss Marple case. Section 1. The silver discs in the border street. Mary Mead wore that particular look of innocence which only villagers of long standing can contrive. Clipped yews, polished brass, gossip in clean aprons, and a sense that the world beyond the lane must be vulgar merely because it moved too fast. On the morning of the vicarage restoration fete, the air was full of roses warming under the sun, bees in the lavender, and the small metallic click of teacups being counted on trestle tables. Then, from the upper meadow behind the old court, there came a scream so absolute in its terror that it slit the morning open from end to end. Miss Marple, who had just been considering whether the Bantry's cook had used too much lemon in the sponge mixture, set down the plate in her hand and looked up at once. She never hurried. Hurrying, she had often observed, was what people did when they wished to look innocent, or else when they had not yet learned that the important thing in life was to arrive with one's mind in advance of one's feet. Beside her, Mrs. Bantry gave a little cry and said, "Good gracious! That came from the court grounds." Several women abandoned plates, 2 men dropped a length of bunting, and a cluster of children started toward the gate, until the vicar's wife called sharply to them to stay where they were. Over beyond the orchard wall, where the old court's neglected upper garden rose in a tangle of elder, moss and crumbling brick, another cry came, lower this time, frightened and breathless, like someone praying badly. The old court had not always been neglected. 30 years earlier, it had been one of the handsomest houses in the district, with a conservatory that had been remarked upon as far as Much Benham, and an Italian garden that had once appeared in a county magazine. Now only fragments of that order remained. A broken sundial, a lily pond gone green, and along the path to the old ice house, a drift of honesty plants gone to seed, their translucent discs hanging in pale sprays that trembled in the light like 100 small moons. "That bed ought to have been cut down weeks ago," said Miss Marple softly, as if the honesty itself had something to do with trouble. Mrs. Bantry looked at her. "My dear Jane, do you mean to stand there discussing seed heads?" "I have often found," said Miss Marple, rising, "that what is neglected has a way of telling one where to look." They went through the wicket gate into the court grounds, with others gathering behind them. The vicar, his wife, Mr. Sims from the butcher's, young girls in summer frocks, and old Mrs. Bartlett from the post office, who was already making the sort of face people make when they have no information and mean to supply the deficiency by imagination. Near the top of the slope, just where the brick mouth of the old ice house showed beneath a drooping yew, a crowd had formed around 2 workmen. One of the men, white to the lips, had taken off his cap and was twisting it in both hands. The other stood rigid, staring downward into the opened chamber. Miss Marple saw first the smell before she saw the thing itself. Not rot now, not after all those years, but damp stone disturbed after long confinement, mould, old earth, and the stale sweetness of dead vegetation. Then the circle of bodies shifted, and she saw, deep in the shadowed hollow, what the workmen had found. The skeleton lay on its side in the sunken floor, as though it had turned in sleep and never woken. Tatters of greenish fabric clung here and there. One arm was crooked under the ribs. At the throat, a chain still glimmered faintly. Near the skull lay something bleached and brittle, no more than a flattened spray of husk and stem. "Lord save us," murmured Mrs. Bantry. The vicar crossed himself before recalling that he did not do such things and converting the gesture into a cough. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived by the path from the village, crouched and peered down with the professional gravity that country doctors wear at births, deaths, and committee meetings. "No one touch anything," he said. "Has the police been sent for?" "Yes, doctor." It was Lucy Brent, companion to Mrs. Adella Lanscombe of the old court. She had come quickly, but not quite quickly enough to disguise the fact that she had paused somewhere to put on lipstick. She stood very straight, her pretty face tense under a hat trimmed with cornflowers. "Mrs. Lanscombe is coming now." There was a little current of attention at that, and all turned toward the path. Adella Lanscombe came more slowly than one expected of a woman summoned to catastrophe. She was 62, handsome still in the rather Roman manner that some women attain after youth has gone and character has taken command of the face. Her hair was beautifully arranged, her pale mauve linen absolutely correct, her hands gloved despite the heat. Everything about her suggested decision, standards, discipline. Yet as she approached the ice house, the colour left her cheeks so completely that the line of her mouth seemed to darken by contrast. "What is it, Lucy?" she asked. "What absurd thing have they found to upset everybody?" Then she saw. Miss Marple, who had watched women receiving bad news in drawing rooms, hospitals, lodgings and railway stations, saw the instant of recognition. It did not come as horror comes to the innocent. It came like something expected too long. Mrs. Lanscombe did not gasp. She did not clutch at anyone. She merely stopped, as though a wire had drawn taut through her body, and her eyes fixed not on the skull, but on the chain at the throat. "Dear God," she said, in an even voice. "So at last." Lucy Brent moved quickly. "Adella, please. I am perfectly well." Mrs. Lanscombe did not faint. She did a more revealing thing. She turned away and looked toward the bed of honesty bordering the ruined path, those transparent discs stirring faintly in the breeze. For a moment her face was not composed at all, but stripped bare with an expression so private and so exhausted that Miss Marple, who was both observant and decent, looked aside. When she turned back, the mask had returned. "You had better inform the inspector that the house will, of course, place every facility at his disposal." "Do you know who it is?" asked Dr. Haydock. There was a fractional pause. "No," said Mrs. Lanscombe. "How should I?" But Miss Marple noticed that the gloves on Mrs. Lanscombe's hands had tightened into fists. Inspector Craddock arrived within the half-hour from Much Benham, sunburned, neat, and apparently unruffled, though Miss Marple knew him to be both shrewder and more patient than his easy manner suggested. He greeted her with a respectful inclination, greeted Mrs. Bantry with cheerful resignation, and began the methodical business of limiting access, directing questions, and peering into a village memory that, once pricked, bled freely. "Any women missing from the district about 30 years ago?" he asked Dr. Haydock. At once 5 answers emerged, none wholly consistent. There had been a maid at the George who left under a cloud. There had been a girl from Little Paddocks who ran off with a commercial traveller. There had been a widow's niece who took a situation in London and wrote only once. Mr. Sims remembered an unfortunate business with a tobacconist's assistant. Mrs. Bartlett declared with confidence that the remains must be foreign because of the chain. Mrs. Bantry said sharply that chains were not exclusive to the continent. Lucy Brent said nothing. Adella Lanscombe stood still as a carved figure beneath the yew and watched the activity with an expression that might have been fortitude or imprisonment. Miss Marple moved a little way off to where the honesty swayed. Its seed heads were dry now, papery silver in the sun, and when one brushed them, they gave a delicate, clattering sound, like thin coins in a miser's hand. She bent and touched one lightly. "A very curious plant, Honesty," she said. Craddock, coming up behind her, smiled. "You're beginning very early, Miss Marple." "My dear Inspector, one always does begin very early. It's only that one very seldom knows it at the time." He glanced toward the ice house. "You saw Mrs. Lanscombe?" "Yes." "And?" Miss Marple watched Lucy Brent lighting a cigarette for herself, with fingers that shook more from irritation than fear. "And she is a woman who has spent a long time preparing herself for something she hoped would never happen." "That sounds almost unkind." "No, only human." By noon, the fate, though ostensibly postponed, had not entirely dissolved. English villages do not abandon arrangements easily. They merely lower their voices and carry on with a darker relish. Tables remained under the chestnut trees, though the children were sent indoors and the brass band told not to arrive. The vicarage lawn acquired that subdued excitement which attends disaster occurring at a polite distance. People who would have been ashamed to stare openly from behind curtains wandered into one another's kitchens or drifted toward the green under transparent pretenses. News moved from gate to gate, improved as it passed. Miss Marple went, at Mrs. Bantry's insistence, into the shade of the drawing-room for a restorative cup of tea. Dolly Bantry, dropping sugar into both cups with more force than exactitude, said, Adella always had a look as though she knew where every spoon in the house had got to, even when one had only just mislaid it. I never liked her much. That doesn't mean I wished a skeleton in her garden. Few things do, said Miss Marple. Did you hear what she said? So at last. If that doesn't mean something, I never played doubles at badminton. It means a great many possible things. Dolly leaned forward. You know whom I thought of instantly? Rosamond. Miss Marple lifted her eyes. Ah. You remember, of course. You were away with your aunt in Bournemouth for some of it, but you must remember the talk afterward. Rosamond Lanscombe, Adella's younger half-sister. Pretty as a picture, silly as a basket, and gone in one night. Adella said she'd run away. There was a story of money missing and a man from London. People believed it because it was the sort of thing people do believe when a girl is very pretty. People often mistake prettiness for intent, said Miss Marple. Dolly nodded vigorously. Philip Deering never believed it. He was wild about the girl, before he went abroad, you know. Not that there was an engagement, Adella saw to that. She thought Rosamond flighty, and perhaps she was, but there was something queer in the whole business. No letter, no sighting, nothing. And after Leonard Lanscombe died, Adella would never let the subject be mentioned. Miss Marple's hands lay folded on the teacup. One notices sometimes that what is forbidden in a household is more instructive than what is discussed. You do think of Rosamond. I think, said Miss Marple, that when a woman sees a skeleton and looks first at the chain on its throat, she is remembering a particular person and not a general calamity. The afternoon dragged its net of rumour wider. Craddock stayed at the court. A constable went up and down the path. Dr. Haydock came and went. Gerald Lanscombe arrived from town looking harassed, fashionable, and inadequately sober. He was Adella's nephew on her dead husband's side, a fair man in his middle 30s with charming manners, expensive ties, and the sort of smile one sees more often in debt than in contentment. He kissed Mrs. Lanscombe's cheek, stared at the police, and immediately asked Lucy Brent what the devil all this business meant. His voice carried. Mrs. Lanscombe received him in the long morning room with windows opening toward the ruined garden. Miss Marple happened to be in the hall at the moment, not by design, though design had very little to do with where she found herself in times of strain. She was usually where concern, tea, or confusion put her. Through the half-open door, she heard Adella say in a voice of level weariness, "It means precisely what it appears to mean, Gerald. Something buried has been unearthed." "Then for heaven's sake let Craddock sort it out. You look ghastly." "I dare say. Sit down." There was a short silence. Miss Marple might have moved on, but another tone had entered Mrs. Lanscombe's voice when she spoke again. "I sent for Mr. Renshaw this morning, my solicitor. There are certain arrangements to be altered." Gerald gave a sharp little laugh. "Now? Really, Aunt Adella, is this the time to be melodramatic?" "On the contrary, it is the time to be exact." Miss Marple went quietly away then. Eavesdropping is vulgar unless one learns from it, and she had already learned enough to think Gerald's evening might not improve. At 7 o'clock, when the long heat of the day had gone softer and the honesty bed showed pearly in the dusk, a message came from the old court, asking whether Miss Marple might step over, if convenient, for a few moments. The request was from Mrs. Lanscombe herself. "She wants you?" said Mrs. Bantry in amazement. "Jane, what have you done? Turned into a bishop?" "People who have lived respectably for a very long time," said Miss Marple, putting on her cardigan, "sometimes prefer to speak to someone who appears not to matter." Adella Lanscombe received her not in the drawing-room, but in the old schoolroom at the back of the house, now used as a sort of private sitting-room. The lamp was already lit. The curtains were not drawn, and through the open French door one could smell evening stocks and damp grass. On the table beside Mrs. Lanscombe stood a little cut-glass bowl containing several stems of honesty. Against the lamplight, their round, translucent coins seemed like extinguished halos. "You are kind to come, Miss Marple." "Not at all." Mrs. Lanscombe did not at once begin. She sat with both hands on the head of her cane, looking not at Miss Marple but at the bowl of honesty. Up close, one could see that she was far more shaken than she wished known. The skin under her eyes had gone fine and grey, and there was a repeated tremor in the left hand that her posture could not quite hide. "People think me a hard woman," she said at last. "Perhaps I have been one. It is possible to become hard merely by arranging oneself so that one does not break in public." Miss Marple said nothing. "I thought," Adella went on, "that I had paid for silence. That is to say, one never does pay for silence. One only leases it, and very badly. It appears I have had an exceptionally long tenancy." She gave a little breath that was not quite a laugh. "How absurd that sounds." "Not absurd," said Miss Marple, "only tired." Adella looked at her then with a quick, searching expression. "You know who it is." "I think you do." For a moment the older woman seemed on the edge of speech. It came and was checked. "Tomorrow morning I shall speak to Inspector Craddock." "That would be wise." "Yes." She looked again toward the open dark beyond the door. "There are wrong things one does in a flash, Miss Marple, and then spends 30 years continuing because one cannot endure the first minute of stopping." Before Miss Marple could reply, there came a soft tap at the door, and Hester Pike entered with a tray. She was a large-boned woman of about 60, clean, competent, and colourless in the way some devoted servants become when they have spent their lives effacing themselves into another person's requirements. Yet tonight something in her stillness was violent. She set down a pot of tisane and biscuits. "You've not eaten enough, ma'am." "I'm not hungry, Hester." "You must keep your strength." The words were ordinary, the tone was not. Hester's eyes flicked once toward Miss Marple, then to the bowl of honesty on the table. One of the brittle discs had snapped, and her hand moved at once to remove the broken piece. At the mention of tomorrow, which Adella had made scarcely a minute before, Hester's knuckles tightened around the tray so abruptly that the spoon rang against the cup. Miss Marple saw it. Adella saw it too. "Hester," she said quietly, "that will do." The housekeeper hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." When she had gone, silence remained in the room like a third consciousness. Adella spoke with difficulty. "She has been with me a very long time." "Yes." "She is loyal." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Loyalty can be one of the most dangerous of the virtues." Adella shut her eyes briefly. "You understand more than I had hoped." "Not enough, but perhaps enough." Adella rose then, slowly, leaning on the cane. At the threshold of the French door, she stood looking into the darkness where the old garden ran away toward the ice house and the ruined glass house beyond. The seed heads of honesty were only pale blurs now. "Tomorrow," she said again, but this time the word sounded less like resolution than like a reprieve already failing. Section 2. What the Village Remembered. Tomorrow hung in the room a moment after Mrs. Lanscombe had spoken it, so distinct that Miss Marple felt, absurdly enough, as though she might have reached out and touched the word before it faded. Adella remained at the French door, her back very straight, the cane in one gloved hand, while outside the first moths moved over the dark lawn in uncertain loops. Behind them, the honesty stems in the bowl shivered as the door admitted a draught, and their faint, papery rustle was like someone turning old letters. "You must not stay up," Miss Marple said after a moment. "Fatigue makes courage untidy, and one always needs courage arranged properly if one is to use it." To her surprise, Adella smiled, a real smile, though a worn one. "That is exactly the sort of thing my governess used to say if one cried at French verbs. Thank you." She did not, however, return to her chair. "Do you ever find, Miss Marple, that people forgive what is dramatic and never what is mean?" "Very often." "It is an odd injustice. Great wickedness has grandeur in some eyes, whereas a shabby thought, a petty jealousy, a mean instant, those are what remain unbearable." Adella's fingers moved restlessly over the knob of her cane. "I once thought I should confess because it was right. Now I think I shall confess because I am tired of carrying not only what I did, but what people would invent if I did not speak first." "That is also a kind of rightness." The older woman turned. "You are more charitable than I deserve." "No, only old." That drew a brief breath of laughter. Yet even in laughter, Adella's face had the look of someone standing on a narrow bridge above deep water. Miss Marple left shortly after, not because there was nothing more to learn, but because the room seemed full of things Adella must arrange alone before morning. Papers, thoughts, perhaps prayers, though Adella did not strike one as a praying woman except in extremity. Hester Pike was in the passage when Miss Marple came out. She stood beside a little table with folded napkins in her arms, as though she had merely been delayed in household business. But her eyes were fixed upon Miss Marple with an expression of guarded inquiry so intense that it stripped all domestic innocence from the napkins. "Good night, miss." "Good night, Hester." "You'll have had tea?" "Yes, thank you." Hester inclined her head. "Mrs. Lanscombe has had a great shock." "I do not doubt it. It would be better if folks did not talk her to death tonight." The phrase, humble as it sounded, had in it a queer possessiveness. Miss Marple observed, "People generally talk the living much more than the dead." For one instant, something flashed in Hester's face, alarm perhaps, or resentment. Then it was gone. "Good night, miss." On the path home, the dusk smelled of cut grass and watermint. At the Bantry's gate, Dolly pounced at once. "Well?" Miss Marple removed her gloves finger by finger. "Mrs. Lanscombe intends to speak to Inspector Craddock tomorrow morning." "About the skeleton?" "Yes." Dolly stared. "Then she does know." "She knows enough to be afraid of daylight." Dolly's eyes widened happily at the phrase, then sobered. "Jane, you don't suppose— actually— murder?" Miss Marple looked over the hedge toward the dark bulk of the old court trees. "I think, my dear, that when bones lie hidden in a private garden for 30 years, somebody at the least made a shocking housekeeping decision." The village, meanwhile, was remembering at full stretch. There is no human faculty more elastic than recollection after an event has provided it with a point. By breakfast next day, St. Mary Mead had reconstructed half its own past. Rosamond Lanscombe's disappearance, which some had not thought of in years, came back with embellishments, certainties, scraps of old phrases, and details that had probably never existed until required. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Simpson told the milkman that Rosamond had once been seen crying in church. At the post office, Mr. Weatherby asserted that money had gone missing the very week she vanished. Mrs. Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, remembered a quarrel on the tennis lawn. Dr. Haydock, more responsibly, recollected only that Rosamond had seemed unhappy and that Leonard Lanscombe had been a fellow with charm but very little ballast. The difference between those statements, Miss Marple often reflected, was the difference between memory and appetite. She had not finished her marmalade when a note arrived from Inspector Craddock, asking if she might be at home to him at 11. Before that hour came, however, another piece entered the pattern. Lucy Brent appeared at the Bantry's door in a motor scarf, looking composed by force. "I'm so sorry to intrude," she said to Miss Marple, "but Mrs. Lanscombe asked whether Inspector Craddock had been here yet." "He has not." "Ah." Lucy sat only when pressed, and even then on the edge of the chair. She intended to see him directly after breakfast. Hester took in her tray. "When I went up 10 minutes ago, she said Mrs. Lanscombe was resting and must not be disturbed." It seemed unlike her. Adella is not a woman who rests when there is a duty to be performed. "Did you disturb her?" asked Miss Marple. Lucy hesitated. "No, Hester was so insistent, and to be truthful, I dislike scenes before coffee." Dolly Bantry, listening with undisguised interest, said, "My dear girl, if there's a body in a garden, one really can wave coffee." Lucy coloured. "I know how that sounds. I only mean that Hester becomes impossible when she takes control. She has been with the family forever, and behaves at times as though the rest of us are intrusions." "Has Mrs. Lanscombe seemed afraid of anything particular?" Miss Marple asked. Lucy looked at her quickly. "Afraid? No. Troubled, yes. Last night she told me to send for Mr. Renshaw, her solicitor. She also asked for a locked dispatch box that hasn't been opened in years." "Did she open it?" "Yes. She was alone with it for nearly an hour." Lucy glanced down at her gloves. "When I brought in hot water later, there was an envelope on the table and some old papers. One of them had dried seed heads pressed in it, those translucent things from the garden. She shut the lid at once." "Honesty," said Miss Marple. Lucy gave a small shiver. An unpleasant name just now. A motor stopped at the gate. Craddock had come sooner than expected. He heard Lucy out, became very still, and rose at once. "I think," he said, "we had better all go to the old court." They did not go all. Dolly, whom no one invited, took it ill and was obliged to be soothed with the promise of later particulars. Miss Marple accompanied Craddock and Lucy across the lane. The morning was deceptively lovely, sun through chestnut leaves, white butterflies over the grass, and somewhere beyond the wall, the distant ring of a hammer where a man continued repairing the fate booths, because country arrangements survive even disaster. At the court front door, Hester herself admitted them. Her face was composed, too composed. "Inspector, Mrs. Lanscombe is not receiving this morning. She was awake late." Craddock's tone remained pleasant. "I am afraid I must see her, Mrs. Pike." "She is asleep now." Lucy brushed past. "Then she may be woken." What followed happened quickly and with dreadful neatness. Hester moved as though to bar the staircase, then stood aside. Lucy went up first, Craddock behind her, Miss Marple more slowly. In the bedroom, the curtains were half drawn against the sun. The air smelled of lavender water, stale, fireless hearth, and something medicinal. Adella Lanscombe lay in bed, one hand on the sheet, her face turned a little toward the window. She looked, at first glance, peculiarly calm. At second glance, she looked dead. Lucy gave a short, gasping cry. Craddock crossed the room in 3 strides. Miss Marple remained by the door, seeing, as one sees in moments of shock, small things with absurd clarity. The silver-backed brush left on the dressing table, a saucer with the brown ring of untouched tea, a medicine bottle uncapped, and on the bedside table, beside a folded handkerchief, one lone honesty disc, no bigger than a shilling, detached from its stem and translucent as skin held to the light. Dr. Haydock came, summoned by a maid running. He examined the body, the bottle, the pulse no longer there. "Too much digitalis, I should say at once," he murmured. "Heart patient, wasn't she?" Lucy made a sound of protest. "But Adella was always meticulous with doses." "People are not meticulous when upset," said Hester from the doorway. "She'd a terrible shock yesterday. She sat up late over old papers. I begged her to rest." Craddock looked at her. "You gave her the medicine?" "I put it on the tray, as always." "And the tea?" "Yes." "Who saw Mrs. Lanscombe alive this morning?" "I did," said Hester. "At 7:30. She said she wished to be left quiet for an hour." Lucy turned sharply. "Why didn't you tell me that?" Hester's face did not alter. "Because I was obeying her wishes, miss." Craddock asked no more then. It was too soon, too public, and Miss Marple saw he understood that if he pressed Hester before the others, she would stiffen into mere service. Still, the manner in which Hester stood by the bed, with grief, yes, but also with a hard, proprietary refusal in her posture, struck Miss Marple more strongly than any tears might have done. By afternoon, the village had 2 sensations instead of 1, and this improved matters dreadfully. A skeleton in the icehouse was thrilling. A respectable widow dead in bed before making a statement was deliciously sinister. The Blue Boar passed from speculation to certainty in under an hour. Gerald Lanscombe, who had argued with his aunt about money the previous evening and was known to be hard up, emerged at once as leading villain in popular opinion. He had been seen leaving by the side gate at nearly midnight. He was her heir, or had been thought so. He drank. He had once backed an impossible horse and complained loudly about taxation. For a village mind, these things form a cumulative criminality. Craddock, being a professional, did not announce any such conclusion. Yet when Miss Marple saw him in the library, going through Adella's writing desk, while a constable stood by the door, his expression suggested that Gerald interested him. On the desk lay a new will, unsigned. Its provisions, Craddock told Miss Marple after some hesitation, left the bulk of the estate to a trust for village housing and church repairs, with only a modest annuity to Gerald. There were also small legacies, one for Lucy Brent, one for Tom Pike, and one substantial sum for Hester. "Enough for motive?" Craddock asked dryly. "For several people. which is why motive is always so tiresome if one has too much of it. He smiled faintly. There was also an envelope addressed to you. To me, it was empty. Then she meant to put something in it and did not. Precisely. He closed the drawer. And the dispatch box Lucy mentioned? Half empty. Some papers old, some destroyed. We found one photograph album page torn, and a prayer book with something removed from the middle. Miss Marple's eyes went to the window, beyond which the path ran toward the ruined garden and the bed of honesty. Removed recently? Hard to say. Why? Because people preserve odd things between the pages of prayer books. Hair, pressed flowers, letters, little scraps of the past. They keep them partly for comfort and partly because a prayer book is one of the last places the practical mind thinks to search. He regarded her. You think Mrs. Lanscombe had kept something all these years? I think she had kept too much. That evening, when the house had quieted into the ugly order that follows a death, Miss Marple stood for a moment alone at the drawing-room window. Far off in the dusk, she could see the honesty in the border catching the last light, each seed pod silver as a coin laid on closed eyes. Behind her in the hall, someone began to cry and then stopped abruptly, as though even grief must be careful in the old court. Section 3. Inspector Craddock's Convenient Theory. Even grief must be careful in the old court, and because it must, it made the house curiously lucid. The servants went about their duties with lowered voices and red-rimmed eyes. Lucy Brent smoked too much and made brittle little jokes that collapsed after leaving her lips. Gerald Lanscombe, who had started the day indignant and ended it visibly frightened, found himself watched by every maid, constable and curtain in St. Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock, moving through all this with apparently mild attention, began to assemble the sort of theory that practical men are obliged to test first because it lies nearest the surface. The theory was Gerald. It had much to recommend it. He had a motive in money. He had quarrelled with his aunt on the night before her death. He had visited her room late, as one maid was prepared to swear after a useful prompting of memory. He knew she meant to alter her will. He had debts of an unbecoming kind and recent letters pressing for payment. Most importantly, he possessed exactly the degree of carelessness which the world associates with vice. A cautious scoundrel is far less likely to be arrested than a slapdash weakling, because police and public alike prefer a culprit whose habits can be understood over breakfast. Miss Marple said as much to Craddock when he found her in the morning room after luncheon, sorting through a basket of mending that Mrs. Bantry had thrust upon her, with the remark that even murders did not improve torn cuffs. "You don't like my convenient theory," he observed. "My dear Inspector, I have never liked convenience except in bathing arrangements. With crimes it leads to a great many errors. Gerald lies badly. Yes, so do all weak men when frightened. That does not necessarily make them murderers, it only makes them tedious." Craddock sat down opposite her. "He admits the quarrel. His aunt told him she would not settle his latest debts and meant to alter the will. He left angry. He says he drove as far as Much Benham, found himself too upset to sleep, and returned by the side gate near midnight, intending to apologize. According to him, he saw a light under her door, lost his nerve, and went away again. One maid heard footsteps. Another thought she heard voices. And do you think he went into the room? I think he may have. Whether to argue again or merely beg, I can't yet tell. If she had already taken an overdose, Miss Marple snipped a thread. But she had not. Craddock looked at her sharply. Why so certain? Because Mrs. Lanscombe sent for you. That is not what people do when they mean to kill themselves in the night. Even guilty people prefer their arrangements finished. Suppose it was an accident. Then someone is being very clumsy in the direction of helpfulness. She laid down the cuff and folded her hands. Hester Pike insisted on keeping everyone away. She reported Mrs. Lanscombe asleep when, from what you say, she had likely been dead some hours. And there was that little honesty disc on the bedside table. Craddock frowned. You've not yet told me what troubles you about the honesty. Not troubles, interests. A thing may be a symbol, an accident, or a message. One must not decide too soon which. But I noticed yesterday evening that Hester could not bear a broken piece of honesty left on the table. She removed it instantly, as if disorder in that particular form distressed her beyond reason. Servants clear things. Old servants curate memory. He gave a reluctant laugh. If I put that in a report, the superintendent would have me retired. Then it is fortunate you needn't. The inquiry widened. Old records were sought. The parish registers produced dates, marriages, deaths and confirmations, but no explanation for Rosamond Lanscombe's disappearance. She had vanished at 24. Leonard Lanscombe, Adella's husband, had died the following year of pneumonia in London. A housemaid who had served at the court then was now dead. The former butler was in a home in Kent and remembered nothing useful except that there had been trouble in the ladies' wing. Dr. Deering, once young Philip Deering, and now a grave middle-aged physician returned from years in Africa to care for an ailing sister nearby, admitted he had known Rosamond well and had hoped to marry her. "I did not believe she ran away," he told Craddock in Miss Marple's presence, "but I had no proof of anything else. Adella told me Rosamond was unstable and had disgraced herself. I was a fool then. I let myself be wounded and proud when I ought to have been suspicious." "Why suspicious?" Craddock asked. Philip Deering looked toward the ruined garden. "Because Rosamond had tried twice in the week before she vanished to speak privately with me, and each time was interrupted or frightened off. The last time she said only, 'If anything happens, don't believe what Adella says about me.' I thought it was lover's nonsense, though she was not my lover. That is what shames me." "Did she have a lover?" He paused. "If by that you mean was she involved with Leonard Lanscombe, I don't know. The village whispered it. Leonard flirted with every woman under 40 and some over it. Rosamond was living in the same house. That was enough for scandal. But she seemed less vain than distressed." After he had gone, Craddock said, "A little late for chivalry." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but late chivalry is often the most honest kind. The prompt variety usually hopes to be admired." Lucy Brent furnished a different sort of complication. Her references, when examined, proved not false exactly, but selective. She had spent several years on the stage in touring companies under another name, had once been associated with a married producer, and had quitted that life abruptly after what she called a highly educational collapse. The village received this with satisfaction. A woman who wore lipstick before alarm naturally improved any mystery. Lucy met Miss Marple's lifted eyebrows with spirit. "You needn't look at me as though I were a chorus girl in church. I told Adella enough. She liked me because I was not born to rugs and reticence. She said I made honesty possible in a room." "Did she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, though perhaps she chose the wrong plant." Lucy took a hard pull at her cigarette. "She wasn't a lovable woman, Miss Marple, let us be clear. She expected gratitude as if issuing invoices, but she had courage, and she could be generous when she chose. If you're wondering whether I poisoned her for a legacy, I assure you that if I wanted money, I should have attached myself to something less severe." "Were you fond of her?" The younger woman looked surprised. "In flashes, never steadily. No one was, I think, except Hester." That answer lingered. Miss Marple asked to see the upper garden. Craddock consented, sending a constable with her more out of form than necessity. The afternoon had gone close and heavy, with thunder far off beyond the downs. The ice-house mouth was boarded now. The path beyond led to what had once been a handsome glass house, its roof mostly broken, the iron ribs exposed to weather and green with lichen. Honesty had self-seeded everywhere, silver discs trembling among nettles, roses and rank grass. In one corner of the glasshouse stood an old potting bench, a rusted watering can, and a length of cracked hose. There was also, Miss Marple noted, a narrow door in the back wall leading toward the kitchen yard, a servant's shortcut. She stood very still. The place had that oppressive intimacy abandoned structures sometimes retain, as though emotion had soaked into brick and iron. One could imagine voices here carrying oddly under the panes, a quarrel sounding louder for being half enclosed, footsteps on the path outside, and anyone emerging with bits of dried seed caught in the hem of a skirt. At her feet lay a recent cigarette end of a brand Lucy smoked. Nearby, half hidden in moss, glinted something else, a tiny snap fastener, old, darkened, perhaps from a glove or handbag. She picked it up. "Do people often come here?" asked the constable. "People go wherever memory makes an appointment," said Miss Marple. Back in the house, she found Hester in the still room, arranging preserves that no one could possibly wish arranged that day. The elder woman looked up without surprise. "Can I get you something, miss?" "No, thank you. I was only thinking what a handsome garden it must once have been." Hester set down a jar. Mrs. Lanscombe's sister was fond of flowers, wild things mostly, stuff that seeded itself, not proper bedding. "Rosamond?" "Yes." The name came out flatly. She was that way, things running where they pleased. There was dislike in the phrase, but beneath it something more strained. Miss Marple said mildly, "And yet the honesty still comes up after all these years." Hester's mouth hardened. It would. Once you let honesty in, it spreads. An odd remark. More odd because Hester seemed to hear it herself and wish it unsaid. She turned back to the shelves. Miss Marple's eye fell upon a row of medicine phials neatly aligned in a tray. Among them, a fresh bottle of digitalis prescribed for Mrs. Lanscombe. "You were careful of her medicines." "I was careful of everything belonging to her." "Yes." Hester swung round suddenly. "Folk will say things now. They always do. They said things about Miss Rosamond, wicked things. They'd say worse about my poor mistress if they got the chance. You know what villagers are." "I do indeed." "Then you know decent women get no mercy from talk." Miss Marple looked at her with soft attention. "No, nor from those who love them badly." Colour rose under Hester's skin, surprising in so pale a woman. "I don't know what you mean." "Perhaps neither do I. Not yet." The first real break in Craddock's convenient theory came not from Hester, but from the unsigned will. Mr. Renshaw, Adella's solicitor, arrived with the previous testament, drawn 5 years earlier. In that version, Gerald indeed inherited nearly all, but attached to Renshaw's file was a note, dictated by Adella only 2 days before the skeleton was found, instructing him to prepare extensive changes because certain obligations long delayed must be met. She had also requested a private appointment for the following morning, the morning on which she died. "That weakens suicide and strengthens urgency," Craddock said. "And weakens Gerald in one way," Miss Marple answered. "If he wished her dead for money, it was already too late. She had set the change in motion. Unless he didn't know how far it had gone." "Quite. But weak men rarely kill on paperwork when they can plead on emotion." Craddock drummed fingers on the desk. "Then who did know? Hester, possibly. Lucy, perhaps. Any servant hovering in passages. And there is Tom Pike." Tom was Hester's son, the old court gardener, a heavy-shouldered man of about 40, with an awkward, watchful face and a history the village had never let him forget. At 20, he had served 6 months for stealing from a warehouse in Much Benham. Since then, he had behaved unimpeachably, which in the eyes of many constituted suspicious perseverance. He admitted being in the upper garden late the previous evening. He admitted, too, that his mother had begged him to keep away from trouble. When asked what she meant, he muttered that she was upset and said queer things whenever the past was stirred. "Did your mother know Rosamond Lanscombe?" Craddock asked. "I suppose so. She knew everybody in the house." "Did she ever speak of her?" Tom hesitated too long. "Only that there'd been unhappiness." "And Mrs. Lanscombe?" Tom's gaze shifted. "She was good to my mother." "Good enough for your mother to do anything for her?" The man's jaw tightened. "People do for those they belong with." Miss Marple, hearing that later, thought it one of the saddest sentences she had ever encountered. Belonging is a very noble human need, but it has filled prisons and graveyards since the world began. That night, as thunder crept closer, and the honesty outside the drawing-room window rattled dryly in the gathering wind, Miss Marple sat wakeful with knitting untouched in her lap. Gerald was convenient. Lucy was decorative. Tom was available. But convenience, decoration, and availability never yet explained the peculiar expression with which Hester Pike had said, "I was careful of everything belonging to her." One might say as much of a silver teapot, a shawl, or a child. Section 4. The Nephew with Debts. Belonging, Miss Marple thought, was the word that explained half the disasters of domestic life, and she was still considering it when the storm broke at last. Rain came hard against the panes, the gutters overflowed, and the old house took on that enclosed, listening quality which country houses assume in thunder, every corridor a throat, every closed door a withheld opinion. Somewhere after midnight, Gerald Lanscombe knocked, somewhat unsteadily, at the library door where Inspector Craddock still sat over papers. "I've had enough of being looked at like a Borgia by the maids," Gerald said. His charming face was pale from drink and anxiety in nearly equal measure. "If you think I killed my aunt, arrest me and have done with it. If you don't, stop making the place feel like a cheap detective serial." Craddock indicated a chair. "Sit down." Gerald sat, then stood again, then sat. He was not a man constructed for sustained dignity. "I did go upstairs last night," he blurted. "Yes, all right, there it is. I did go in. She wasn't asleep. She was sitting up with a pile of papers on the bed and looked about 90. I apologized. She said it was too late for apologies and asked whether there was anything in me she had not already paid for. Beastly thing to say, but not unfair, I suppose." He passed a hand over his face. "Then she said she meant to see you in the morning, and that after tomorrow there would be no more lies in the house." "No more lies about what?" "She didn't say. I asked if it was about the skeleton. She told me to leave. I did." "You touched the medicine bottle on the table." Gerald stared. "Touched it? I may have knocked it, I don't remember. She was fluttering over the papers and I moved things to sit down." "Good God, is that enough to hang me with?" "Probably not." Gerald gave a humourless laugh. How reassuring. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain because Craddock knew she saw more in confessions than most magistrates, observed the young man carefully. He was selfish, vain, frightened, and accustomed to pleading by charm when principle failed him. But he had one quality murderers of this domestic, protective sort rarely possess: emotional laziness. To kill with forethought for money is one thing. To manage a household death, an old scandal, a servant's silence, and one's own nerves all at once is quite another. Gerald did not look equal to folding a railway timetable. "What papers were on the bed?" she asked. "A lot of old rubbish. Letters tied with ribbon, I think. A photograph album. Some awful little silver things." "Silver things?" He frowned. "Transparent, rather. Those garden discs, like paper money for fairies." She had one in her hand and kept rubbing it between her fingers till it crumbled. Craddock's glance met Miss Marple's for an instant. "What happened then?" "I told her she was being melodramatic. She said melodrama was merely truth discovered by the wrong people. Then she asked me whether, if she had done a thing one wicked minute of her life and spent every other minute paying for it, I thought God kept accounts by the minute or by the thing. I said I had no idea and wished she'd stop talking like a Russian novel." Gerald swallowed. She laughed, not pleasantly. "Then she told me to go. So I went. That's all." It was not, however, all. Pressed a little farther, Gerald admitted he had seen on the bed a blue-covered prayer book with something tucked inside it. Later, after going downstairs, he had lingered in the morning room, found the book on a side table, and looked into it out of curiosity. "There was nothing there," he said. "Only a torn page, but Hester came in like Nemesis and nearly snatched the thing from me. She said that was not my property. One would have thought I was stealing the crown jewels." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Craddock asked. Because every time I mention anything, I sound guiltier. The storm spent itself by dawn. The next morning rose washed, green, and pitilessly clear. A police car took Gerald to Much Benham for further questions, not under formal arrest, but with sufficient visibility to satisfy the village. By 11 o'clock, Mrs. Bartlett at the post office had 3 independent witnesses to his handcuffing, none of them accurate. Lucy Brent, furious, declared the police had fixed on Gerald because he was easy. Hester said nothing at all and worked twice as hard. Miss Marple spent the late morning in Adella's former room with Craddock, Mr. Renshaw, and a woman constable sorting papers. Adella had been orderly, even in torment. Accounts were precise. Bills were paid. Charitable subscriptions dated back years in her neat hand. Beneath that layer of control lay another. Bundles of old correspondence, some burned, some preserved, some rearranged in a curious way, as if the past had been handled repeatedly and never concluded. The blue prayer book Gerald had mentioned lay on a side table. It was a cheap leather binding, feminine, 30 years out of fashion, with the name Rosamond Frances Lanscombe written inside in looping young script. Several pages bore the pale, circular ghosts left by pressed flowers long since removed. In the centre, just where Gerald had said, one page had been torn carefully out. Miss Marple touched the ragged inner edge. "Not old damage," she murmured. Craddock bent nearer. "How can you tell?" "The rest of the book is evenly dust-dulled. This edge is cleaner. Something was taken out recently and not very skillfully." She turned another page. "And here, see? A smear of green, like old plant stain." The woman constable, searching the writing desk, exclaimed softly, "Inspector, there's a fragment tucked in the blotter." It was no more than half a sheet, browned with age, the fold lines nearly broken through. Only part of the writing remained. "Cannot bear him in the house when Adella is kind to me before everyone. If Philip knew, he would insist and there would be a scandal. She would think the worst, and I could not endure that from her." The bottom of the page was gone. Craddock whistled under his breath. "That sounds less like an elopement than trouble of a much uglier sort." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Leonard Lanscombe?" "Very possibly. Or someone Rosamond feared in the house." Renshaw, the solicitor, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "My late client never mentioned such a thing to me." "No," said Miss Marple. "People rarely consult solicitors at the moment when they most need mothers." By luncheon, the existence of the fragment was known to several persons who ought not to have known it, which is to say, the household. Lucy Brent, told discreetly not to discuss it, naturally discussed nothing else with Miss Marple the moment they met alone in the conservatory passage. "So Rosamond didn't run off after all," Lucy said. "Or not simply. If Leonard cornered the girl, it explains half the atmosphere in old photographs. Adella always spoke of him as if she were describing a portrait that had faded correctly. She never forgave him for dying before she could finish hating him." "Did she speak often of Rosamond?" "Never. That was the odd part. Never once, except to say her sister had been weak." Lucy's mouth tightened. "You know, I used to think Adella severe because she despised ordinary moral failures. Drink, bad debts, adultery, all the usual village theatre. Lately I've wondered whether she despised in others some one instant in herself." Miss Marple looked at the younger woman approvingly. "That is intelligently put." Lucy shrugged. "The stage teaches one to read vanity. Respectability is only vanity washed and ironed." In the afternoon, Craddock called on Tom Pike in the potting shed and emerged unconvinced by the man's account of his own movements. Tom said he had been in the lower orchard during part of the evening, in the kitchen yard for the rest, and nowhere near the house after 10. A stable boy contradicted him by recalling footsteps near the servants' path to the old glass house close to midnight. Tom then changed his statement and admitted he had gone up to see whether his mother was all right. "Lying again," Craddock said afterward with weary disgust. "Not necessarily about the important part," Miss Marple replied. "Men like Tom Pike often lie first from shame and only afterward from purpose. They expect blame, so they prepare for it even before it arrives." Your sympathy is trying. It is also useful. The useful thing came sooner than either expected. Toward 4 o'clock, a maid brought in a small cardboard box she had found behind the morning room curtains while beating dust from the hem. Inside lay several pawn tickets in Gerald's name and a note in Adella's hand, dated 3 weeks earlier. I will not sell Rosamond a second time to pay your debts. Craddock read it twice. That, he said, is most inconvenient for Gerald if he's innocent. But very convenient if someone wished him suspected, said Miss Marple. He looked up sharply. You think the box was planted? I think curtains are odd repositories for financial shame, unless one is performing. Gerald, confronted, went scarlet and swore the tickets were his, but the note had been in Adella's desk, not his pocket or any curtain. He had indeed begged for money and had been answered with those words. He insisted he did not know what she meant by selling Rosamond a second time. I thought it was one of Aunt Adella's biblical maledictions, he said miserably. She had a gift for phrasing things as if one had just betrayed Christ for a sovereign. Craddock let him go for the moment, though not far. In the village the matter was otherwise. Gerald's character, always flimsy, collapsed under the combined pressure of debts, pawn tickets and family drama. By evening, even the vicar's wife, who prided herself on Christian restraint, had adopted the tone of one speaking sorrowfully of a young man who had thrown away every advantage and probably poisoned his aunt besides. Miss Marple listened to these verdicts from a chair on the Bantry's lawn, while tea cooled neglected beside her. Over the hedge she could just see the honesty bed at the old court, white silver in the slant light. She thought of Adella's phrase, 30 years continuing because one cannot endure the first minute of stopping. Gerald would never endure even 10 seconds of moral pain if he could turn away from it. He might borrow, wheedle, conceal and despair, but he did not possess the grim tenacity the case implied. No, if the note behind the curtain had been planted, it had been planted by someone who understood houses, habit, and the small dramaturgy of suspicion. Someone who knew precisely where dust would be beaten and by whom. Someone for whom Gerald's weakness was useful because it was obvious. That night, when Craddock came across, with new irritation in his face, Miss Marple said before he could speak, "You have not arrested him." "No, blast it. I could, but I shouldn't like it. Too many things are neat in the wrong places." "Quite." He sat down heavily. "What do you make of the phrase about selling Rosamond a second time?" Miss Marple threaded a needle. "I imagine," she said slowly, "that Mrs. Lanscombe believed she had once sacrificed Rosamond to preserve something else, reputation perhaps, or marriage, or simply appearances. When Gerald wanted money, it touched the same sore place. That means Rosamond's disappearance was not merely hidden, it was used." "In what way?" "Ah," said Miss Marple, "that is where the dead continue to be so tiresome. They refuse to clarify." Section 5. The thing pressed in the prayer book. The dead refused to clarify, but the living, under pressure, began to do so against their will. The next morning Miss Marple asked to see the attic trunks that had not been opened in years. Craddock, who was learning that resistance to her requests wasted time, sent up a constable to help lift them down. The attic at the old court was hot, dusty, and thick with that stale sweetness which belongs to dried lavender, old linen, forgotten leather, and human lives folded away without resolution. Rosamond's trunk stood apart from the others, not because it had been honoured, but because someone had never quite decided whether it should be destroyed. Her initials were painted in fading white on the lid. Inside lay summer dresses too girlish for any current wearer, a straw hat with a broken ribbon, dance programmes, 2 French novels, a packet of pressed sea lavender, and the remnants of a youth interrupted before it had learned how to become style. There was also a little ivory-backed brush, cracked, and a photograph of Rosamond laughing under a tennis net, head thrown back, beauty careless and unwarned. Lucy Brent, who had insisted on coming because, if one is to raid a ghost's wardrobe, one may as well do it properly, looked at the photograph and said, "No wonder the village called her silly. People always call beauty silly when it frightens them." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was examining a narrow workbox lined in green silk. In it were thread reels, a thimble, and, caught in a corner, half of a metal snap fastener darkened by age. She took from her purse the matching half she had found in the ruined glass house. The pieces fitted. Craddock, watching, gave a low exclamation. From Rosamond's glove? Or handbag, or coat cuff, something that came apart under strain. Miss Marple glanced toward the open attic window, where beyond the roofline one could see the upper garden and the pale drift of honesty swaying below. And one part remained in the glass house all these years. Lucy, suddenly grave, said, "Then she was there that night." Yes. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in tissue gone nearly to dust, lay a lace fichu and a folded piece of green wool cloth, cut irregularly as if from a larger garment. In one corner of the cloth clung a tiny ghost of root and seed membrane, flat and translucent. "Honesty," said Miss Marple. Craddock took it carefully. "Pressed into the fibres?" "Yes. If Rosamond brushed against the plants running by the path to the glass house, or fell there, it might have stuck." Lucy sat back on her heels. "Good God, that means Adella must have known from the first where she'd been. Not necessarily from that, but from other things perhaps." The work of the morning yielded one more object of importance, a tiny key sewn into the hem of a petticoat. It opened not a jewel case or romantic drawer, but the old escritoire in the disused morning room at the back of the house, the room now seldom entered except by servants dusting. In a hidden compartment there lay 3 letters tied with black ribbon. They had been written by Rosamond and never sent. 2 were to Philip Deering, 1 was to Adella. Craddock read them in silence first, then handed them to Miss Marple. "My darling Philip," one began, "I am ashamed not because I have done what they think, but because I did not cry out when I ought. If I tell you, you will demand justice, and there will be none, only filth for Adella to hear. He says she has had enough humiliations through him and must not have another." The letter to Adella was shorter, unfinished, blotted hard at the centre, as though tears or a hand had stopped it. "Adella, if I cannot tell you with my mouth, I must with my hand. You must not believe him if he says I tempted him. I hated him for making me afraid in my own room. If there is a child, it is not from love. Philip would help me, but I have not your courage, and I dread your looking at me as if I were dirty." Lucy made a strangled sound. Craddock swore quietly under his breath. Miss Marple laid the letter down very carefully. "So," said Craddock, "Leonard Lanscombe. He assaulted her. She feared Adella would think the worst. She meant to tell. And then she vanished." "Yes." Miss Marple's voice was almost inaudible. "And Adella, who said yesterday that people forgive dramatic wickedness sooner than mean thoughts, knew by the end of her life exactly what her mean thought had cost." The phrase chilled even Lucy into silence. "Where were these hidden?" Craddock asked. "In a compartment Rosamond herself prepared, I think, using the sewn key." Miss Marple touched the black ribbon. "But someone else found them later. Adella, almost certainly. She kept them, did not destroy them. That is important. It proves remorse. It proves memory. Remorse is a more difficult plant." Craddock took the letters away at once to be copied and secured. News of their contents was, for a few blessed hours, contained. During those hours Miss Marple walked alone through the upper garden and allowed the pattern to alter itself in her mind. Leonard, then, had been the corrupter or brute, perhaps both. Rosamond had intended disclosure. Something happened in or near the glass house before she could speak. Adella afterwards found, or was given, the letters proving that Rosamond had not been Leonard's mistress, but his victim. Yet Adella maintained the story of elopement. Why? Because she had participated in the concealment, certainly. But the exact form of that participation mattered profoundly. Near the broken potting bench she found Tom Pike, cutting back nettles with unnecessary violence. He stopped when he saw her and leaned on the billhook, wary as a dog expecting stones. "Fine weather after rain," said Miss Marple. Tom gave a grunt. "You knew Rosamond a little?" "I was a boy. Boys see a great deal when they are sent on errands." He looked away toward the honesty bed. "I saw enough to know there was misery." "Did your mother speak of it?" A muscle moved in his cheek. My mother spoke of service, that's all. Service can include carrying heavy things at odd hours. His head came round sharply. What are you saying? Nothing, yet. Tom set the billhook down with care. If you're after my mother, you'll get nothing from me. She gave her life to this house. That is sometimes the trouble. He stared at her with sudden misery rather than anger. You don't know what it is to have one person be the whole difference between decency and the gutter. No, said Miss Marple softly, but I know it can make gratitude into slavery. He turned away without answering. The hidden clue of the day revealed itself almost absurdly late, and by pure domestic chance. The woman constable, rechecking Adella's bedside table, found tucked under the liner of the drawer a single flattened seed disc mounted in a scrap of old notepaper. On the paper, in Rosamond's youthful hand, were written 3 words only: for truth, later. Miss Marple held it to the light. The disc was more delicate than skin, its membranes intact, the tiny pearl-like seeds long gone. A keepsake, Lucy whispered. Yes, or a promise. Craddock said, if Rosamond pressed this and marked it for truth, and Adella kept it all these years, then the motif belonged first to Rosamond, said Miss Marple, not to Adella. That matters too. Lucy, who had been bracing herself with cynicism, sat suddenly and covered her eyes. She was just a girl. Miss Marple's face changed a little. Girls are often just girls to everyone except the people who ruin them. Late that afternoon, Philip Deering came again. When shown Rosamond's letters, he went white to the lips and then an old red rose under the skin. He stood by the window with the letter to Adella in his hand, as if he feared his own fingers would tear it. I would have married her, he said. That sounds pompous now, but I would have. Child or no child, scandal or no scandal. I only needed to know. Miss Marple, who knew how useless such truths were, and how necessary they remained, said gently, yes. He turned. Adella must have read this after whatever happened, and still she let the village believe. She let the village believe a lie that punished Rosamond and protected the house. We know that. We do not yet know whether she invented the lie or submitted to it after the fact. Is there a difference? Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles. There is always a difference between striking the blow and living inside it. By evening, the honesty in the border had altered again in her mind. It was no longer merely emblematic, not merely the village's pale irony. It was Rosamond's own small code, pressed into paper for a later truth that never came from her hand. Perhaps she had liked the plant because its pods turned see-through when dried. Perhaps because as a girl she had laughed at the name. Now its brittle silver discs seemed to hang all over the garden like tiny, unanswered intentions. Section 6. Faces at tea. Tiny, unanswered intentions hung not only in the garden, but over the whole household the following day, when the postponed fete tea was absurdly, stubbornly, partially revived as a parish gathering in aid of the church roof. The vicar's wife declared that cancellation would amount to surrendering Christian order to morbid excitement. In truth, everyone wished to see everyone else in one place. English respectability has always preferred its crises accompanied by sponge cake. Miss Marple attended because one must attend where people are most anxious to appear ordinary. The vicarage lawn looked almost indecently cheerful under bright cloths and bowls of roses. Women poured tea with lowered voices. Men discussed weather and cricket with an emphasis suggesting alibis. Children, released again, ran in bright loops at the edge of adult distress. And threading through all this, like a draught beneath a door, was the knowledge that a dead girl had lain 30 years in the old court icehouse, and that another woman had died before speaking of it. Gerald, not arrested but morally handcuffed by village opinion, presented himself in a dark suit and a face of comic martyrdom. Lucy arrived in white, looking as though she meant to affront death by eyeliner. Tom Pike stayed at the edge near the trestle tables. Hester did not come. She had a headache, which no one believed and everyone understood. Philip Deering stood with Dr. Haydock near the chestnut tree, too grave to mingle and too responsible to leave. Miss Marple moved among them like a small, patient current. She listened to Mrs. Price Ridley deplore sensationalism while avidly recounting details. She heard Mr. Sims say that girls nowadays had no moral ballast, forgetting that Rosamond had vanished before most current girls were born. She let Dolly Bantry whisper, "If Hester isn't there, she's either ill or dangerous." Dolly had excellent instincts and very little restraint. The real work began when tea divided people into temporary intimacies. Miss Marple found Gerald alone beside the urn, staring with dislike at a plate of seed cake. "You look persecuted," she observed. "I am persecuted. If 3 more women ask whether I am bearing up, I shall poison the village in earnest." He took a breath. "Miss Marple, I swear to you I did not kill my aunt." "I know." He blinked. "You know?" "Yes, but you do know something you have not said." His relief faltered at once into caution. "Only family rot. Does one have to make a public convenience of it?" "Usually not. Privately will do." Gerald looked toward the lawn, where Lucy laughed too brightly at something the curate had said. "Very well. 2 months ago, Aunt Adella received a letter from abroad. I saw the postmark, Madeira, I think. She read it and looked as if she had swallowed metal. That evening she asked whether I had ever heard of a woman named Elvira Kane. I had not. She said, 'Of course not. The dead don't keep the same names.' Then she locked herself in the morning room for hours." "Elvira Kane," Miss Marple repeated. "Did the letter remain in the house?" "I don't know, but after that she became different, worse in some ways, better in others. She started asking odd questions about settlements and legitimacy, and what became of children adopted quietly in the 20s. I thought she'd gone mad with genealogy." Miss Marple's heart gave one firm little beat. A child, then, had entered the buried pattern even before Rosamond's bones were found. Lucy Brent provided a separate piece. She joined Miss Marple under pretence of adjusting the flower bowl and said under her breath, "Hester went into Adella's room after the police sealed most of it. I know because I saw her from the back stairs. She came out with something in her apron pocket and nearly collided with Tom." "Did you tell Inspector Craddock?" "Not yet. I wanted to be certain I wasn't merely disliking her theatrically." Lucy's mouth sharpened. "Also, if I tell the police everything the moment I know it, they stop confiding in me. One must preserve the useful image of a frivolous woman." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Frivolity is often treated as a veil when it is only a fan." At another table, Philip Deering submitted, with poor grace, to Dolly Bantry's determined kindness. When Miss Marple joined them, Dolly tactfully wandered away at once, leaving Philip with tea he did not want. "Gerald has told me of a letter from Madeira," said Miss Marple. Philip's face altered. "So there was one. You know more?" "Not more. Only that Rosamond had an aunt in Madeira once, an elderly cousin of her mother's, who took in difficult girls very discreetly. Adella mentioned her years ago when fending off one of my questions. She said if Rosamond had any sense she'd gone there and made herself useful. I thought it a cruel invention." "It may have been half an invention." He set down the cup abruptly. "Miss Marple, do you mean Rosamond had a child?" "I mean only that Mrs. Lanscombe was making inquiries about one." His expression then, pain, hope, horror and belated tenderness all fighting in a man's middle-aged face, was one Miss Marple did not forget. "If there was a child," he said, "and Adella knew." "Yes, then one more debt existed." The confrontations deepened when Craddock, deciding perhaps that open air loosened tighter tongues than interrogation rooms, asked several direct questions on the lawn itself. He spoke first with Tom, who denied seeing his mother carry anything from Adella's room. Lucy contradicted him by implication with a lifted eyebrow visible across half the lawn. He spoke next with Mrs. Price Ridley, who suddenly recalled that 30 years before, Hester had gone to the vicarage after midnight in the rain to ask for old blankets for a sick dog. Hester had not had a dog. None of these things was proof. All were cracks. When the gathering finally thinned, Miss Marple remained seated under the chestnut while the last cups were collected. The lawn after people leave a fete has a melancholy unlike any other. Paper napkins stirring, chairs askew, a trampled grace. Inspector Craddock came across it with the look of a man who has too many partial truths and no decent spine to set them on. "You were right about Hester," he said without preamble. "We searched her room. Nothing conclusive, but the ash in her grate contains old paper burned recently, and in her work basket was a foreign reply coupon dated 2 months back. Also a torn address label from a Madeira hotel. The letter Gerald mentioned. Most likely. If Hester intercepted some of Adella's correspondence, she would have done so for years if she thought it necessary." Miss Marple looked toward the lane where Tom was waiting for his mother, though she had not come. "Have you asked what Elvira Kane may mean?" Craddock nodded. "Wireless inquiries are out, but a retired hotel keeper in Madeira may take time. Meanwhile, Hester says she knows no such name." "Of course she does." The last of the sun went from the lawn. In that dimming moment, Lucy Brent came hurrying from the vicarage porch with something clenched in her hand. Her self-possession was gone entirely. "I found this in the tea-urn cupboard," she said, "hidden behind the spare linens. Tom saw me and tried to take it." It was the missing page from Rosamond's prayer book, torn and folded small. Inside it lay not only another flattened honesty disc, but the lower half of a letter, the continuation of the fragment found in Adella's blotter. "If there is a child, I shall go away before she sees me altered. Better she think me wicked than know I am frightened. If only Hester would let me speak to her alone. She watches me as if I were already a disgrace in the house." The paper trembled in Lucy's hand. Tom, coming up behind her with a face like stone, said hoarsely, "You had no right." Craddock turned on him. "No right to what?" Tom looked from one face to another and understood, too late, that silence had narrowed into trap. "It wasn't hers to read," he muttered. "Whose was it?" asked Miss Marple. He did not answer, but the hatred in his eyes was not for Rosamond, nor even for the police. It was for the whole machinery by which hidden loyalty gets dragged into daylight and called evidence. Section 7. The Son Who Lied for His Mother. The whole machinery of daylight moved on Tom at once. Craddock took him not to the station immediately, but into the vicarage study, closing the door on the murmuring lawn outside. Miss Marple remained because neither Craddock nor Tom objected quickly enough, and because she had learned long ago that people in moral extremity often spoke more freely before an apparently harmless older woman than before a row of official faces. Tom stood by the mantel, fists opening and closing. Rain threatened again beyond the window, though the sky still held. "Well," said Craddock, "why was that page hidden in the tea-urn cupboard?" Tom stared at the carpet. "Because I put it there." Lucy, seated rigidly by the desk, gave a little exasperated breath. "At last." "Be quiet, Miss Brent," Craddock said mildly. Tom lifted his head. "I found the page in my mother's room. She'd burned some old papers, but not that one. I took it because I knew if the police saw it, they'd come at her again. So I hid it, that's all." "Why protect your mother unless she had something to hide?" Tom's expression twisted. "Because you don't know what folk can do to a woman with nothing but service and reputation. Because if you've spent your whole life being told one person gave you your chance, you don't stand by and watch them dragged." "Did your mother kill Mrs. Lanscombe?" The answer came too fast. "No." "Did she help hide Rosamond's body?" Tom shut his mouth. Craddock waited. Silence, properly used, can be more severe than accusation. At length, Tom said in a low, stubborn voice, "I helped with nothing 30 years ago. I was a boy, but I knew there'd been something. I knew my mother was afraid whenever Miss Rosamond's name came up. After the bones were found, she said old wickedness would ruin everyone now. She said some truths ought to stay buried because all they do is spit filth on the dead. Last night she asked me to burn a paper. I did not read all of it. Enough. About a child. About Miss Rosamond being frightened." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "A child?" Tom nodded once, miserable. "There was more letter in the stove ash. I couldn't save it." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Did your mother tell you whose child?" "No," he swallowed. "Only that it was none of the village's business then or now." It was a false confession, but not entirely false. Tom had hidden evidence. He had lied repeatedly. and his ready willingness to be judged in order to shield Hester was sufficiently dramatic to redirect every practical mind in the room. Outside, the village would soon improve him into principal culprit or gallant accessory, according to taste. Craddock did not arrest him on the spot. He sent a constable to keep him in sight and went straight to the old court with Miss Marple. The house had drawn in upon itself during the afternoon. Blinds were half lowered against heat, footsteps cautious, speech clipped. Hester Pike met them in the back hall, with an expression that hardened at once when she saw Tom in custody through the open door. "What have you done to him?" she demanded. "Only asked questions," said Craddock. "Now I'll ask you some." They went to the morning room. The honesty border outside the windows gleamed wanly under the thickening sky. Hester remained standing. She had ceased to look colourless. Fear had driven blood up into the face, giving her a harsh vitality. "You burned papers from Mrs. Lanscombe's room," Craddock said. "I burn rubbish every day." "You intercepted a letter from Madeira 2 months ago." "No. We found the coupon." "That proves nothing." "You removed the missing page from Rosamond Lanscombe's prayer book." Hester's chin rose. "If I did, maybe it was to spare decent people from reading filth." Miss Marple watched the words strike and settle. Not sorrow then, not innocence, but moral proprietorship. Hester did not speak of facts. She spoke of decency, as such natures always do when they are about to commit or excuse something unforgivable. "What child was mentioned in the letter?" Craddock asked. No answer. "Hester." No answer again. Then, unexpectedly, Lucy Brent entered without invitation, white with anger. "You hateful woman," she said. "Did you know all along?" Craddock snapped, "Miss Brent." But Lucy went on. "Did you know Leonard forced her? Did you watch Rosamond trying to speak and keep her away from Adella, because it was easier to have one disgraced girl than a scandal in the house?" Hester turned on her with startling violence. "You know nothing. You with your painted face and your cheap judgments. You know nothing of what it takes to keep a house standing when men do wickedness and women are left to clear it." The room froze around that sentence. Craddock said very quietly, "That is an interesting choice of words." Hester seemed to hear herself only then. She pressed both hands against the back of a chair until the knuckles blanched. "Mr. Leonard were a bad lot," she said, each word dragged out like wire. "There, are you pleased?" He laughed at tears. He'd pinch the girls in passages and say they'd imagined it. Miss Rosamond were frightened, yes, but fright doesn't excuse what came after. "What did come after?" Miss Marple asked. Hester's eyes came to hers, and in them Miss Marple saw something dangerous. Not merely guilt, but long-ripened conviction. "Everything falls when ladies don't hold themselves straight," Hester said. Miss Adella held straight. She carried what others dropped. Before more could be got from her, the second shock broke over the case. A maid came running from upstairs with a scream half swallowed. In Hester's room, tucked under the mattress as though placed there in panic, Craddock found a small, sealed packet addressed in Adella's hand. "To be given, if I fail to speak, to Miss Jane Marple." Inside lay only a railway left luggage ticket and the line, in Adella's writing, "Elvira Kane arrived from Madeira under another name." Hester knows. Lucy caught her breath. Craddock turned slowly toward Hester. "So Mrs. Lanscombe did mean to tell?" Hester said nothing at all. The left luggage ticket led that very evening to a suitcase at Paddington, long deposited and nearly forgotten. By special arrangement it was brought down unopened to Much Benham Station and then to the inspector's rooms. Miss Marple, Craddock, Lucy and Philip Deering were present when it was unlocked. Inside were plain clothes of modest quality, a packet of Madeira hotel bills, a photograph of a thin, dark woman in middle age, and a birth certificate from 1927 for one Eleanor Mary Kane, mother Elvira Kane, no father named. Also present, folded among the clothes, was a letter from the woman in the photograph to Adella Lanscombe. "I had no right to write," the letter said. "I am dying and have become cowardly about truth. My mother was Rosamond Lanscombe. She told me so only at the end, under another name, and bade me write you because she said you had once loved her and once wronged her and had paid ever since. She would not tell me my father's name. She said Hester Pike would know. If there is any justice left between women, tell me whose child I have been all my life." Philip made a low sound and sat down heavily. Lucy put a hand to her mouth. Craddock stared at the page. "Rosamond lived," he said, "at least for some time after whatever happened." "No," said Miss Marple. All three looked at her. She touched the photograph. "This woman's mother may have called herself Rosamond, or may have been told she was Rosamond's child, but the birth certificate is 5 years after Rosamond vanished. The dates do not fit if the body in the ice house is hers and has lain there 30 years. Then what the devil? Then somebody used Rosamond's name again, or gave it to another woman, or lied to a child for reasons of pity, convenience, or concealment." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And Hester knows how." Craddock swore softly. "A redirection worthy of the theatre." "Yes," said Lucy bitterly, "and all of us good audience." The case had altered in a single hour. If the skeleton was Rosamond, Elvira's story was false or manipulated. If Elvira truly had a claim, then some missing woman other than Rosamond lay in the ice house. Every assumption loosened. Gerald ceased for the moment to matter. Tom's false confession became merely filial smoke. Hester, cornered yet still withholding, grew more central by the minute. As they left the station rooms near midnight, rain finally began again, soft and insinuating. Miss Marple paused beneath the lamp, where the wet shone on the pavement like varnished memory. "Hester has built her life on choosing which truth another woman may bear," she said. Craddock pulled up his collar. "And now?" "Now," said Miss Marple, "I think she must be made to believe we have misunderstood in precisely the way she most cannot endure." Section 8. Miss Marple's Test. Misunderstood in precisely the wrong way. That was the only lever likely to move Hester Pike, because facts alone had failed. Facts accuse, but with certain natures, only an affront to their private moral arrangement will make them speak. The next morning, Miss Marple asked Craddock for 10 minutes with Hester and received them, though not without a warning that he would remain within call. Hester had not slept. Her face was waxen, her mouth set so tightly it seemed painful. She was in the still room again, cutting bread that no one immediately needed. Miss Marple sat down near the window where one could see, beyond the kitchen yard, the topmost silver discs of the honesty bed stirring in a dull wind. "You must be tired, Hester." "I've work." "Yes, one always has." Hester cut another slice. Miss Marple let a few moments pass. "Inspector Craddock has had a very interesting development from the Madeira letter." The knife paused. "Has he?" "Yes. It appears increasingly likely that Mrs. Lanscombe arranged, after Rosamond vanished, for another woman to travel abroad under her name, perhaps while Rosamond herself was still alive somewhere. A cruel device, if true. To make a frightened girl seem wicked for convenience, well, it would put Mrs. Lanscombe in a very ugly light indeed." The knife came down on the board with such force that the loaf tore. "You've no right," said Hester thickly. "Of course I may be mistaken, but it would mean that even after Rosamond begged for help, Mrs. Lanscombe deliberately chose to protect the house over the girl, that she knew perfectly well what Leonard had done, and yet sold Rosamond's name to some poor creature for a cover story. One cannot imagine much colder behaviour." Hester turned then, and the face she turned was transformed by fury and injured devotion. "Cold? She weren't cold. She never knew, not then, not till after. She thought—" The words broke from her before she could stop them. "She thought the girl were false to her, that was all. One wicked minute, yes, but not cold. Don't you sit there and make her into that." Miss Marple did not move. Then tell me what she was. The bread knife slipped from Hester's hand and struck the stone floor. She stared at it as if it belonged to someone else. When she spoke again, the violence had gone out of her voice, leaving something far more dreadful, endurance stripped of purpose. She were angry, Hester said, like ladies get when pride's hurt deeper than sense. Miss Rosamond had been trying to speak with her for days, but I kept saying, not now, not in the hall, not before dinner, not while Master were in the house. I thought if I could just keep things smooth a little longer, there'd be a way found. There never is, of course, but servants tell themselves so. That evening Miss Rosamond ran to the glass house after tea, and Mrs. Lanscombe followed. I heard raised voices. By the time I got there, she pressed both hands hard against the table edge. Miss Rosamond was on the floor by the stone bench. Her head had struck the corner. Mrs. Lanscombe had the brass spray in her hand and was saying, she laughed at me. Only the poor girl couldn't have laughed. She was dead already. The words fell into the room with the flat certainty of something rehearsed in silence for 30 years. Miss Marple said very softly, and Mrs. Lanscombe thought Rosamond had willingly been with Leonard. Yes, she'd seen his chain round the girl's neck, and they'd been whispering in the village, and Master had told her lies enough beforehand. Miss Rosamond tried to speak, Lord knows she tried, but ladies in a rage hear only what matches the wound. Then it was done. Hester's eyes had fixed on the window, on the moving honesty beyond. I found the letter after, the one to Mrs. Lanscombe and the ones to Dr. Deering. They'd fallen out of Miss Rosamond's work bag when she went down. I read enough to know Master had forced himself on her. I knew then my poor mistress had killed the wrong version of the story. Did you tell her? Not that night. Hester gave a sound that might have been a laugh if laughter had any life in it. How could I? She was sitting in the pantry with blood on her cuff saying, "What have I done? What have I done?" over and over. Master was out. I thought if the police came, she'd hang for it or go mad before they took her. So I said we'd move the body. I said there'd been enough ruin in the house. And Tom? He was a child, slept through, knew nothing then. And Elvira Kane? That struck deeper. Hester shut her eyes. Elvira was under housemaid, flighty, poor, and in trouble of her own by the look. A month after, when people started doubting Miss Rosamond had gone, Master wanted certainty made. He'd already spread about money missing. I hated him for it, but I let him, because once you've hidden one thing, all the ugly little helpers come after. Elvira took some of Miss Rosamond's clothes, a bit of money, and went to Madeira under that name long enough to send a card. Later, she used Kane again. Mrs. Lanscombe paid her twice over the years. That was what she meant by selling Rosamond. First for silence, later for proof. Miss Marple sat quite still. The story had at last the shape she had felt beneath it, and it was uglier, smaller, more human than melodrama. Pride, misunderstanding, masculine corruption, servant devotion, and then 30 years of maintenance. When did Mrs. Lanscombe learn the truth from the letters? The next day. I gave them her because I couldn't keep them from her then. She read them and looked older by 10 years. She said she would go to the police, but Master came in and said if she did, Rosamond would be dragged through every filthy talk in the county, and the child, if there was one, would be born under it. He said no jury would spare a jealous woman who'd struck her sister down. Maybe he were right, maybe he weren't. I only know she sat all night, and in the morning said we would hold to the story of running away. And the child? Hester shook her head. There was no child of Miss Rosamond's. She'd only feared there might be. Elvira had the child, or thought she would. Later, when her daughter wrote, Mrs. Lanscombe knew the old payment had bred a new wrong. She meant to provide for the girl and tell everything. That's why she called the solicitor. That's why... She stopped. Yes, said Miss Marple. That is why you killed her. Hester's whole body flinched, not at the accusation, but at the plainness of it. I couldn't let them have her. Her? Or your idea of her? Don't, Hester whispered. You planted Gerald's pawn tickets. You hid the prayer book page. You burned the letters because they would show Rosamond innocent and Mrs. Lanscombe guilty beyond mistake. You intercepted the Madeira correspondence. And when Mrs. Lanscombe said she would speak to the police at last, you doubled the digitalis in her tisane. Hester did not deny it. She would have been torn to pieces, by papers, by neighbours, by all the little mouths, dead and alive both. Miss Rosamond for what was done to her, Mrs. Lanscombe for what she did in blindness. I could keep one decent thing only if I stopped her. You call that decent? For the first time, Hester's voice sharpened again. You don't know what she were to me. When Tom's father drank us into rags, she found me work. When the boy stole, she kept him from worse. She paid for his second chance. She gave me a room, wages, a place where I was someone. Not grand, maybe, but inside. I belonged. And all those years she carried it. She never had a day's peace. Wasn't that punishment? Miss Marple looked at the woman with a sorrow without sentiment. Punishment chosen is never the same as truth accepted. And you took from her the one brave act she had left. The sentence broke Hester more completely than any threat. She sat down suddenly on the bread box and covered her face with both hands. When Craddock entered at Miss Marple's call, she did not resist him. She only said once, very low, I meant to keep her clean. Tom, brought in later, stared at his mother as though seeing for the first time the size of the thing he had spent his life defending without understanding. He did not cry. Men like Tom rarely do when others are present. But something in him seemed to contract inward upon itself, like a house after fire. Outside, the wind moved the honesty until the whole border shivered silver white. Section 9. The pattern under the pattern. The whole border shivered silver white while, inside the inspector's temporary office at the old court, the contradictions settled at last into a pattern one could name. Hester had spoken enough, but as Miss Marple well knew, confession is often less orderly than truth. It gives motives in lumps and chronology in tatters. So she and Craddock sat after midnight with the letters, the will drafts, the old records, Tom's statements, and the peculiar relics of 3 decades laid out before them like a second, smaller household. Craddock, who was tired but intellectually quickened, drew lines with a pencil over a blank sheet. Rosamond assaulted by Leonard. She writes letters to Philip and Adella. She tries to speak. Hester delays it, ostensibly to preserve order, really because servants fear scandal as if it were weather. Adella, already humiliated by Leonard in other ways perhaps, sees chain, hears rumours, misreads everything. They quarrel in the glasshouse. Adella strikes or pushes. Rosamond falls, dies. Hester arrives, finds letters, conceals body in the icehouse, persuades Adella to lie. So far clear. Yes. Then Leonard amplifies the lie by arranging for Elvira Kane to travel under Rosamond's name. With Hester's assistance and Adella's money. Whether Adella consented at first from numbness or from calculation hardly matters now. Later she knew and was ashamed of it. Craddock nodded. Hence her note to Gerald. I will not sell Rosamond a second time. He begged for money, and she felt the old bargain stirring again. Exactly. He tapped the Madeira letter. Years later, Elvira's daughter Eleanor writes, having been told by a dying mother some garbled tale that she may be Rosamond's child. Adella realizes the falsehood she once purchased has created a whole borrowed identity in another life. She means to make provision and perhaps confess. Then the skeleton is found before she has done either. Yes. But one thing still pricks. Why the packet to you? Why not directly to me? Miss Marple folded Rosamond's letter back into its envelope. Because Mrs. Lanscombe wanted not only official action but comprehension. It is a very female wish. She suspected, I think, that if Hester stood in the way, a policeman would see obstruction and perhaps malice. But another woman might see the shape of the devotion underneath. Adella had lived too long inside Hester's guardianship not to understand how dangerous it had become. Craddock's mouth tightened. Dangerous indeed. He was silent a moment, then said, And the bedside honesty disc? Miss Marple picked it up from the evidence tray where it lay between labelled envelopes. Rosamond's token. For truth, later. Adella kept it by her the last night because she meant, at last, to do what Rosamond had intended. Hester overlooked it in the confusion, or could not bear to destroy the emblem, possibly both. Sentiment in a murderer? Oh yes, particularly then. Murderers without sentiment are rarer than people think. It is sentiment attached to the wrong object that does half the damage in the world. Craddock leaned back. You said earlier that Hester would not endure our misunderstanding. You were right. She could bear being thought criminal sooner than letting Adella be thought cold-blooded, because the private myth mattered more to her than any legal danger. Miss Marple's needles, forgotten beside her handbag, caught the lamplight. I've known that type often. There was a parlour-maid in my aunt's house once who worshipped a dreadful little Pekingese because she'd seen it run to her on the day her mother died. The dog bit everyone for 14 years, but she called it loving. People make shrines out of accidents if the accident answered a loneliness. Craddock gave her a look halfway between admiration and despair. You can reduce any tragedy to a parlour-maid and a dog. Not reduce, said Miss Marple mildly. Translate. The remaining practical matters aligned themselves. Hester had controlled Adella's medicines for years and knew precisely how much extra digitalis would stop a tired heart without immediate struggle. She had chosen the morning after Adella declared her intention to speak. She had delayed discovery, kept Lucy away, and then planted the pawn ticket box to strengthen suspicion against Gerald once she understood the police were looking in his direction. Tom, sensing danger but not truth, had hidden the prayer book page and burned letter fragments at his mother's request, or for her sake. Lucy's observations, born partly of resentment and partly of theatrical alertness, had saved crucial scraps. Philip Deering's memory restored Rosamond's genuine attempts to seek help. Gerald's very weaknesses cleared him by showing the clumsy selfishness of his mind, not the patient ferocity required. At 3 a.m, Craddock sent for coffee. It came in thick cups and tasted of exhaustion. Through the east windows the first paling showed over the yews. "What of Leonard?" he asked at last. "Dead these many years. Convenient for everyone." Miss Marple's face altered in one of those slight ways by which her deepest feelings were known. Men like Leonard are always convenient once dead. They leave women to carry the evidence in their bodies and their tempers. Rosamond feared disgrace more than violence because society trained her to. Adella feared betrayal more than the truth because marriage trained her to. Hester feared the collapse of the house more than justice because service trained her to. He, at the centre, left the room. Craddock stared at the cooling coffee. "You're making this sound bigger than a village crime." "My dear Inspector, all village crimes are bigger than themselves. That is why they are so dreadful." When the formal statement had been taken from Hester later that morning, it added little save detail. She described the brass spray pump still rusting in the glasshouse, the wheelbarrow used to move Rosamond's body at dusk, Adella sitting all night with the letters, Leonard's practical cruelty in arranging Elvira's departure, the years of allowances sent under false names, the returned Madeira letter she had tried to intercept and could not wholly prevent, the final conversation in which Adella said, with strange calm, "I am tired of being preserved." "That was the very phrase?" Miss Marple asked. Hester nodded once. "She said I'd preserved her into something airless." There it was, the moral centre, said not by the detective but by the dead woman herself. Preserved. Like pressed flowers in a book. Like honesty discs flattened between pages for later truth. Like a life kept from scandal until it lost the possibility of grace. By noon the village had, naturally, heard that Hester Pike was under arrest. It had not, naturally, heard the real shape of the matter, and as yet Miss Marple was glad. There would be newspapers soon enough. For a few hours Rosamond could remain merely restored to fact rather than flung to appetite. Miss Marple walked alone to the upper garden before luncheon. The glasshouse smelled of damp iron and nettle sap. On the stone bench, newly dusted for examination, a faint dark stain remained in a crack no one would have noticed 30 years ago, and no one could use now. The honesty at the threshold clicked softly in the breeze. She thought of Rosamond as a girl pressing one silver disc into paper and writing, "For truth," later. There was an almost unbearable pathos in such little symbolic foresight. Young women, Miss Marple reflected, often know in emblem what they cannot yet command in action. Rosamond had wished to tell. Adella had wished, too late, to tell. Hester had wished to prevent telling forever. Around those wishes, 30 years had arranged themselves like furniture around a locked room. When she turned back toward the house, Philip Deering was standing by the yew walk. He looked older than he had looked the week before, but quieter. "Craddock told me enough," he said. "Not all. Enough." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I keep thinking," he said after a pause, "that if I had insisted harder, asked better, watched more—" "Yes, we all think that after. It is a useless honesty, but a common one." He gave a bleak smile. "Do you know what I should like, if it can be done? For Rosamond to have her proper name on a stone. No euphemisms, no beloved sister nonsense that leaves out the truth. Just her name and the dates we know." "That would be well." "And the woman in Madeira, the daughter, Eleanor Kane. Mrs. Lanscombe meant provision for her. I imagine Mr. Renshaw can contrive it from the estate." Philip looked toward the honesty border. "A child born from one lie and fed on another." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but perhaps not condemned by them." Section 10. The Dead Woman's Secret. Perhaps not condemned, and because Miss Marple believed that facts should be set in order before they escaped into gossip and metamorphosed into fable, she agreed to Craddock's request that the principal persons be gathered in the drawing-room that evening. It was an old-fashioned proceeding, and therefore, in village terms, entirely proper. The room held the fading grandeur of the old court, portraits browned with varnish, long windows onto the darkening lawn, and silver on the sideboard polished to an almost reproachful brightness. Outside, the honesty in the border caught the last of the daylight and shone like little moons strung in ranks. Present were Gerald Lanscombe, pale and defensive, Lucy Brent, very still now and without any need of theatricality, Philip Deering, Tom Pike, rigid with misery, Mr. Renshaw, Dolly Bantry by special sufferance and with a look of solemn excitement, and Hester Pike under supervision, seated apart. Miss Marple herself chose the least important chair in the room, which is where the greatest advantage usually lies. Craddock spoke first, briefly, stating that Mrs. Lanscombe's death was not self-administered, and that inquiries into the skeleton found on the property had revealed a long-concealed tragedy. He then asked Miss Marple whether she would explain certain relationships better seen through human arrangements than through statements alone. Miss Marple folded her hands on her bag. "It began," she said, "not with a murder in the melodramatic sense, but with one of those domestic corruptions that seem at first too common to matter. Leonard Lanscombe was a man who treated women as conveniences for his vanity. Such men often appear charming because they have spent their feelings elsewhere and have nothing left to spend at home. Rosamond Lanscombe, being young, dependent, and in the same house, became one of the people he frightened. She wrote letters asking for help. She feared scandal as much as injury, because that is what nice girls were taught to fear." Philip lowered his head. "Mrs. Adella Lanscombe," Miss Marple continued, "was already a woman made sensitive by humiliation. She had a husband who deceived her, and a sister whose beauty and warmth perhaps touched all the places in her where confidence had gone thin. Rumours had begun. A chain of Leonards was seen on Rosamond. There were glances, half-heard phrases, the ordinary poisonous litter of a household where truth is delayed. Rosamond tried to speak. Hester Pike, wanting order, delayed the speaking. That was the first fatal loyalty. Hester made a movement but did not interrupt. In the glass house, 30 years ago, Adella confronted Rosamond and believed what wounded pride told her to believe, that Rosamond had willingly betrayed her. Rosamond attempted to explain, but anger has poor hearing. Mrs. Lanscombe struck her or pushed her with the brass spray pump. Rosamond fell against the stone bench and died almost at once. Gerald swore softly. Lucy shut her eyes. Tom stared only at his mother. Miss Marple's voice remained even. Hester Pike arrived almost immediately. She found the letters and understood what Mrs. Lanscombe had not understood in time, that Rosamond was innocent of the betrayal and guilty only of fear. At that moment, Hester made the second fatal loyalty. She determined that Mrs. Lanscombe should be saved. Not exonerated, you understand. Hester was under no illusions, but saved from the police, the courts, the neighbours, the newspapers, the disgrace. Together, perhaps with more passivity from Mrs. Lanscombe than active choice at first, they concealed the body in the old ice-house. Renshaw put a hand to his brow. Dolly Bantry, unusually silent, looked appalled rather than thrilled. Later, Miss Marple said, Leonard Lanscombe strengthened the lie. A housemaid named Elvira Kane, herself in difficulties and willing for money, was sent abroad for a time under Rosamond's name. That created the rumour of elopement, the traces seen later, and the long, false trail which ended, after many years, in Madeira. Mrs. Lanscombe paid to maintain it. That is why she wrote to Gerald recently that she would not sell Rosamond a second time. She had already once sold Rosamond's good name in exchange for silence. Gerald whispered, "My God." "The years afterward were not simple wickedness," said Miss Marple, and here her eyes moved to Hester, then to the empty chair that somehow seemed Adella's by right of absence. Mrs. Lanscombe discovered Rosamond's letters in full and knew the depth of her own mistake. She lived with that knowledge. Some people would call it remorse, some would call it punishment. Both are true, but neither restores the dead. Hester Pike remained devoted to her, managing the household and, in a sense, managing the guilt itself, preserving it from exposure, arranging the lies, intercepting reminders, even controlling which memories could be spoken aloud. It is a terrible thing to become indispensable to another person's cowardice. One begins by serving and ends by governing. Tom made an inarticulate sound, half protest, half pain. When a letter came from Eleanor Kane in Madeira, Miss Marple went on, the old lie produced a new claim. Eleanor believed, because her dying mother had told her some confused version of the story, that she might be Rosamond's child. In fact, she was Elvira's daughter, but the borrowing of Rosamond's name had altered a life far away. Mrs. Lanscombe then resolved to put matters in order, both financially and morally. The discovery of the skeleton forced her hand. She meant to speak to Inspector Craddock the next morning. Lucy looked toward Hester with naked contempt. "And you stopped her?" "Yes," said Miss Marple before Hester could, because Hester Pike's loyalty had long since ceased to be love in any saving sense. It had become possession. She could not bear Mrs. Lanscombe to fall from the private pedestal on which she herself had kept her. She could endure guilt, lies, bribery, and even the ruin of Rosamond's name. What she could not endure was the public truth about Adella. So she increased the digitalis in Mrs. Lanscombe's morning tisane, delayed discovery, hid and burned papers, and planted evidence to direct suspicion toward Gerald and, if needed, anyone else available. Craddock said quietly, "Mrs. Pike has made a statement to that effect." There was a long silence. Evening thickened at the windows. Somewhere outside, a blackbird gave a last note. Gerald spoke first, in a voice stripped of its usual flippancy. "All those years," he said. "She looked at me as if I were the family disgrace, and all those years—" He stopped. Lucy said, not kindly, "There can be more than one disgrace in a house, Gerald." Philip Deering raised his head. "Did Adella ever ask for forgiveness?" Miss Marple considered. "Not in so many words. Proud people seldom can. But she was moving toward truth, and that is the nearest form of apology some natures manage." Then, unexpectedly, Hester Pike spoke. She had sat all this while with her hands gripped in her lap, the bones prominent, the old servant's posture hardly broken. Now she lifted her head. "She weren't a cruel woman," she said. No one answered, and she went on with that dreadful, plain persistence of the unimaginative once words finally escape them. "Sharp, yes. Proud, yes. But not cruel." She looked at the letters and knew. She never had a happy day after. She wanted to tell more than once. "I stopped her. I said the village would make filth of Miss Rosamond. I said Master were dead, and what good? I said Tom needed place and wages, and she needed protecting, and the house needed carrying on. It all sounded sensible. Sensible is how sin talks when it wears an apron." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "And in the end?" "In the end," Hester said, staring at nothing, "she told me she was tired of being preserved. She said if I loved her, I would let her fall where she ought. I made the tisane stronger. Tom gave a hoarse cry then, not loud, but torn from somewhere childhood and manhood had both failed to mend. He turned away, one arm over his face. Miss Marple's own voice, when she spoke again, was almost tender. That is the answer to the question, is it not? Who kept the dead woman's secret for 30 years? Hester Pike kept it, first out of service, then out of pride, then out of that tragic love which prefers possession to redemption. And because she kept it, one woman lay nameless in the dark, another lived unforgiven even by herself, a son learned to lie in loyalty, and a stranger's daughter grew up under a borrowed story. The room had gone very still. Even Dolly Bantry was crying quietly to her own surprise. Craddock rose. Duty re-entered where explanation ended. Hester stood when asked. As she passed the window, the last light caught on the honesty border outside, and for an instant the silver discs shone behind her like frail coins spent too late. Section 11. Honesty in the border. Spent too late. That was how the case remained in St Mary Mead after the formal business had moved on to magistrates, statements, and the machinery by which the law tries to arrange ruin into sequence. Yet villages recover externally with indecent speed. Within a week the butcher had a new awning, the church fate accounts were balanced, Mrs. Price Ridley had turned from scandal to influenza, and children once again cut across the green, as if no woman had lain 30 years in an icehouse not 2 fields away. Only the old court itself seemed slower to resume its breathing. The upper garden was cleared. Workmen, gentler now because they had been told enough to feel solemn, cut back nettles and straightened the path. Rosamond Lanscombe's remains were given, after what identifications were possible, a proper burial under her own name. Philip Deering arranged the stone exactly as he had wished. Rosamond Frances Lanscombe, 1902-1932. No adornment save a single line from the Psalms about truth in the inward parts. Miss Marple thought that very suitable. Truth, inward parts, and what women were forced to carry there had all been central to the matter. Eleanor Kane, written to through the Madeira address, proved to be alive after all, though poorer than Adella had imagined, and less romantic than any village version would have preferred. She was no mysterious lost heiress, merely a school secretary in Bristol with a weak chest and a practical hand. When Mr. Renshaw explained that the tale of her parentage had been mistaken, but that Mrs. Lanscombe had nonetheless intended a settlement in recognition of old wrongs connected with her mother, Eleanor replied with a brief, dignified letter saying that names mattered less than the fact of having been lied to, and that she would use any money for her daughter's training as a nurse. Miss Marple approved of her immediately, without meeting her. Gerald went away to London and, it was reported, entered some form of useful employment under a cousin who did not advance cash. Adversity, having at last ceased to arrive cushioned by expectation, may even have improved him. Lucy Brent remained at the old court only long enough to help sort what could be sorted. She found in Adella's desk a note addressed to herself, written before the final morning and never delivered. You have often been impertinent, sometimes vulgar, and nearly always more honest than I liked. Stay so. Lucy cried over it, and then laughed at herself for crying. Tom Pike did not leave the village, though for a time people expected him to. Shame holds men to places as often as pride does. He kept on in the garden until the executors decided what was to become of the property, and if he stooped more heavily under hedges than before, he also began, very quietly, to refuse the village's easier sympathies. "My mother did wrong," he said once to Mr. Sims, who had ventured a pitying remark. "Don't tidy it up for me." That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the first wholly free sentence of his life. As for Hester Pike, the law took account of age, circumstances, and confession, but not of righteousness imagined in an apron. She was removed to a prison hospital rather than an ordinary cell. When Miss Marple heard it, she felt neither satisfaction nor resentment, only weariness. Hester belonged to that tragic class of people who confuse guardianship with grace, and cannot see until too late that preserving another person from consequences may be the final form of corruption. One afternoon, some days after the burial, Dolly Bantry insisted on walking Miss Marple up to the old court because I want to see what has been done with those ghastly honesty plants. They found the border still there, though thinned and tied back. The silver discs moved lightly in the Septemberish air. One could almost believe they whispered. I should have rooted the lot out, Dolly declared. Horrid things. Pretty in an underhand way. Miss Marple bent to touch one of the papery moons. No, I think not. A village ought not to destroy all its symbols merely because they have proved accurate. Dolly snorted. Trust you to say that. Do you really suppose Adella deserved pity? Miss Marple stood upright slowly. Yes. And Hester? A kind of pity also, but a very grave one. Dolly looked unconvinced. I can't bear women who make idols out of employers. No, nor can I. But then, my dear, most idolatries begin in hunger. Hester wanted belonging more than goodness. Adella wanted control more than humility. Rosamond wanted to be believed more than she knew how to insist. None of those wishes are exotic. That is why such cases are so disturbing. They went a little farther up the path to where the glass house had stood. Much of the dangerous iron had been removed. Through the open space, one could see the church tower above the trees, and hear, faintly, the ordinary bell for evensong. A black cat slipped through the weeds and was gone, Dolly said after a pause. You know what I keep thinking? If Rosamond had managed to tell her sister just 5 minutes sooner. Yes, said Miss Marple. Life often turns on conversational timing. One is taught to value passion, but punctuality is much safer. Dolly laughed in spite of herself, then grew sober again. And Adella's last chance. She nearly did the right thing. She did do a part of it. She turned toward truth. That matters. But not enough. No, said Miss Marple. Her eyes rested on the honesty border, the pale discs now catching late sun, so that each one seemed briefly lit from within. Not enough for Rosamond. Not enough for herself. Moral arithmetic is wretchedly resistant to late balancing. Still, the attempt matters because it shows what was left alive in her after all the years of preservation. Hester thought she was protecting Adella's goodness. In fact, she killed the first movement of it. They stood without speaking. From somewhere in the house came the sound of a drawer closing, then another. Lucy, perhaps, finishing what remained. The village beyond continued in its familiar register of dogs barking, distant crockery, a bicycle bell at the lane. Equilibrium had returned in the way it always returns, not by innocence restored, but by habit spreading a clean cloth over damage and laying out the cups again. Miss Marple, however, had never believed equilibrium and innocence to be the same thing. Villages were not repositories of purity, they were repositories of memory. That was their terror and their usefulness. In cities, secrets dissolved into motion. In villages, they settled like seeds. Some lay dormant for years, some rose in nettles, some came up, against all intention, as honesty. The churchwomen had already decided, with that bustling mercy peculiar to parishes, to place flowers on Rosamond's grave for the first month until a permanent arrangement could be made. Mrs. Bartlett had sent white stocks, Dolly, unexpectedly moved, had contributed late roses, and Lucy had chosen, with sharp correctness, a small spray of honesty pods laid flat against the earth so that sunlight passed through them. It struck Miss Marple that even now the village was doing what it always did, editing pain into ritual, setting out blooms where once it had set out rumours. There was kindness in that, and cowardice too, but then most social tenderness is a braid of both. At the gate, Dolly paused to adjust her glove. Well, she said, I hope if I ever commit some appalling crime you will not preserve me. My dear Dolly, said Miss Marple with a faint smile, I should expose you at once, and then bring you jelly. Dolly laughed properly then, and the sound went oddly well with the bell from the church and the dry clicking of the seed heads in the border. Miss Marple looked back once more before turning homeward. The path to the old ice house was clear now. The glass house lay open to weather and truth alike. Above it, the honesty stirred, thin and silver and entirely incapable now of hiding anything at all. The end.